The fire had been dead for 6 hours, and frost covered the inside of every cabin window in the valley except one. Inside Torsten Halvorsen's strange, overbuilt structure, the floor remained warm enough to walk on barefoot, while his neighbors shivered through another brutal Wyoming dawn. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more impossible frontier invention. Winter in the Wyoming Territory during 1841 was not merely cold, it was the kind of cold that killed quietly, without drama or warning. The kind that found weaknesses in construction, in preparation, in the human body itself. Torsten Halvorsen understood this reality in the abstract way that all mountain settlers understood it. Cold was simply part of the bargain made when choosing to live in the high country. You accepted it, prepared for it, and survived it through vigilance and effort. The cabin Torsten shared with his wife Ingrid was typical of frontier construction in that era. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace on the north wall, one window with oiled paper covering, and a dirt floor packed hard from use. The structure measured 16 feet by 20 feet. It had taken Torsten and 2 neighbors 5 days to build the previous spring. It was adequate. That word covered most aspects of mountain life. Adequate shelter, adequate food stores, adequate warmth. Luxury was for people in cities. Survival was the measure of success in the wilderness. The fireplace was the heart of everything. From October through April, it burned constantly. Feeding it was a ritual that structured daily life. Torsten rose before dawn each morning to add wood. He tended it throughout the day while Ingrid prepared meals, mended clothing, or worked on the endless small tasks that filled frontier existence. At night, before sleep, he would load the firebox with the largest logs available, hoping they would burn long enough to keep the cabin livable until morning. Most nights, they did. The cabin would stay tolerably warm, perhaps 50 degrees by dawn, cold enough to see breath but not cold enough to freeze water left in a bucket. But maintaining that temperature required the fire to keep burning. If the logs burned through too quickly, if the wood was damp and smoldered instead of flaming, if any of a dozen variables went wrong, the cabin would lose heat rapidly. By dawn, interior temperatures could match the outside air. 20 degrees, 10 degrees, sometimes lower. Torsten and Ingrid managed this reality through their first winter together. They had married in 1839 in a small ceremony at a trading post 3 days' ride south. Ingrid was the daughter of Norwegian immigrants who had settled in Wisconsin before deciding to push further west. She was practical, resilient, and unafraid of hardship. These qualities made her suited for mountain life in ways that softer women would not have been. Their routine worked. The fire burned through most nights. The cabin stayed livable. Food stores held. Spring arrived, then summer, then another autumn. As winter returned in late 1840, they felt prepared. They had learned the rhythms of survival. The cold was manageable. That confidence would not survive the season. December brought temperatures that made the previous winter seem mild by comparison. The cold settled into the valley like something solid, something with weight and presence. Mornings began at 20 below zero. By midday, if the sun emerged, temperatures might climb to 10 below. At night, they plummeted further, 30 below, sometimes 40. At those temperatures, exposed skin froze in minutes. Breath crystallized instantly. Wood became brittle and difficult to split. Ingrid fell ill on the 8th of December. It began as a cough, the kind that seemed minor at first. Within 2 days, fever set in. Her body temperature spiked while the cabin temperature dropped with the setting sun. Torsten kept the fire burning hot, trying to warm the space enough to help her fever break. He boiled water for steam. He wrapped her in every blanket they owned. He stayed awake, monitoring both his wife and the fire. The human body requires sleep. This is not a matter of preference or willpower. After a certain point, consciousness simply shuts down. Torsten had been awake for nearly 40 hours on the night of December 10th. He sat beside the fire, feeding it logs, watching Ingrid's labored breathing. Around 2 in the morning, he added what he thought would be enough wood to last until dawn. Large, split pine logs, dry and ready to burn. He allowed himself to close his eyes for just a moment. He woke to gray dawn light and bitter cold. The fire was dead. Not smoldering, not reduced to coals that could be revived. Completely cold. The logs he had added had been smaller than he realized in his exhausted state. They had burned through completely. The cabin temperature had dropped throughout the remaining night hours. Frost covered the inside of the walls. The water bucket had frozen solid. Torsten moved to Ingrid immediately. She was not breathing. Her skin was cold to the touch. The fever that had burned through her body for 2 days had weakened her enough that when the temperature dropped, her body could not maintain the fight. She had died sometime in the hours between his collapse into sleep and dawn, quietly, without waking him. The cold had simply taken her while he slept 3 feet away. He sat beside her body for an hour, not moving, not thinking clearly. Then he stood and walked outside into the brutal morning air. The sun was rising over the eastern ridge, bright and utterly indifferent. Smoke rose from neighboring cabins where fires had successfully burned through the night. Life continued in those structures. Children would wake, meals would be prepared. The day would proceed normally. Torsten walked back inside. He needed to build a fire. He needed to thaw the ground enough to dig a grave. He needed to do many things. But first, he simply stood in the cabin that had failed to protect his wife, feeling the cold that had killed her and understanding with absolute clarity that adequate was not enough. Torsten buried Ingrid on a hillside overlooking the valley 3 days later. The ground had been frozen solid. He spent 2 full days building fires on the burial site, letting them burn down to coals, scraping away ash, then building new fires. Slowly, the earth thawed enough to dig. Bjorn Lindstrom and 2 other neighbors helped with the actual excavation. They lowered Ingrid's body, wrapped in canvas, into the frozen ground. They covered her with earth and stones. They stood silently for a few minutes in respect. Then they returned to their own cabins and their own struggles to survive the winter. Torsten returned to his empty cabin. The fire was burning. He had kept it fed continuously since the morning Ingrid died, as if making up for the failure. The space was warm, perhaps 65 degrees, comfortable by any standard, but the warmth felt temporary, fragile, dependent entirely on his constant attention and the continued burning of wood in the firebox. He began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. How quickly heat escaped through gaps in the chinking, how cold air seeped in around the doorframe, how the dirt floor remained perpetually cold regardless of how hot the fire burned. Heat rose to the ceiling and accumulated there, wasted, while the lower half of the cabin stayed cool. The single window, even covered with oiled paper, radiated cold inward. The entire structure was designed to lose heat, not retain it. Most men who lost wives on the frontier either remarried quickly or left the mountains entirely. Torsten did neither. He stayed in the cabin through the remainder of that winter, trapping enough to maintain his supplies, but spending most of his time thinking about a single question. Why did cabins have to lose all their heat the moment a fire went out? It seemed like a simple question. The answer seemed obvious. Fire produces heat. When fire stops, heat stops. That was simply how things worked. But Torsten could not accept that answer. He had seen his wife die because of it. The knowledge that adequate fire management was not enough, that a single mistake or moment of exhaustion could be fatal, made the standard answer insufficient. He started paying attention to how different things held or released heat. Metal tools left near the fire stayed warm for a few minutes after being moved away, then cooled rapidly. Stone around the fireplace stayed warm longer, sometimes for an hour after the fire died down. Wood held almost no heat at all. Water in a pot would stay hot for a while, but eventually cooled. Everything released its heat to the surrounding air. Everything equalized to the ambient temperature eventually, but the rates differed. That observation felt important. Some materials released heat quickly, others slowly. Some seemed to absorb heat and hold it. If a cabin could be built using materials that absorbed and held heat during the day, could that heat be released slowly through the night? Could a structure be designed not just to contain heat from an active fire, but to store it and release it gradually? The question occupied Torsten's thoughts through January and February. He had no formal education in physics or engineering. He had grown up on a farm in Minnesota, learning practical carpentry from his father, but nothing about the science of heat transfer. What he did have was time, motivation, and the ability to observe carefully. Spring arrived slowly in the high country. March brought temperatures above freezing during daylight hours, though nights remained bitter. Snow began to melt on south-facing slopes. Creeks swelled with runoff. The valley started the gradual transition from frozen stillness to mud and emerging life. Torsten's food stores were running low by late March. He had been trapping minimally through the winter, focused more on his observations about heat than on building up furs to sell. Now he needed supplies. Bjorn Lindstrom lived 2 miles south in a cabin slightly larger than Torsten's. Bjorn had a wife, Astrid, and 3 children. He also had a root cellar, a substantial one, dug 8 feet into a hillside behind his cabin. Torsten knew Bjorn stored potatoes, turnips, carrots, and other vegetables there through the winter. In late March, with his own supplies depleted, Torsten rode to Bjorn's cabin to see if he could trade furs for food to last until he could travel to the trading post in April. Bjorn agreed readily. He led Torsten to the root cellar and pulled open the heavy wooden door set into the hillside. The 2 men descended crude stone steps into the underground chamber. The space was perhaps 10 feet square and 7 feet high at the center, with a curved ceiling following the excavated earth above. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding barrels and crates of stored food. What struck Torsten immediately was the temperature. Outside, the morning air was perhaps 35 degrees. Inside the cabin, with a fire burning, it would be 60 or 65. But in the root cellar, the temperature felt somewhere between those extremes. Not warm, but not cold. Torsten guessed around 45 or 50 degrees, stable, comfortable enough that he did not need to button his coat. Bjorn noticed Torsten's attention. "Stays like this all winter," he said. "Never freezes, never gets warm. Good for keeping vegetables from rotting or freezing." He began moving aside crates to access a barrel of potatoes, but Torsten barely heard him. His mind was working through the implications of what he was experiencing. The earth itself was maintaining a stable temperature. The root cellar had no fire. It had no active heating source. Yet it stayed warmer than the outside air in winter and cooler than the outside air in summer. The mass of earth surrounding the space was acting as insulation and temperature regulator simultaneously. Heat from deeper in the earth, from below the frost line, was slowly migrating upward. The thick earthen walls prevented that heat from escaping rapidly. The result was a space that maintained equilibrium. Torsten helped Bjorn carry potatoes and turnips out to his horse. He paid with beaver pelts and rode home. But his mind was not on the food. He was thinking about earth and temperature stability, about mass and insulation, about the possibility that a cabin built with some portion of its structure underground might benefit from the same principles that kept Bjorn's root cellar from freezing. Most cabins were built entirely above ground. That was standard practice. It was faster, easier, and seemed logical. But what if a cabin could incorporate underground elements? What if the floor could somehow be connected to the stable temperature of Earth below the frost line? The idea was forming, still vague, but connected to his earlier observations about materials holding heat at different rates. April brought Torsten to the trading post settlement 40 miles east. The journey took 2 days on horseback, following established trails that were finally clear of deep snow. He carried his winter's accumulation of beaver pelts, fewer than a successful season would produce, but enough to trade for supplies: coffee, salt, powder, lead, flour, the essentials that could not be produced or gathered in the mountains. The settlement consisted of a trading post, a blacksmith shop, a small general store, and a sawmill positioned beside a fast-flowing creek. The mill was a recent addition, built 2 years earlier by a Norwegian immigrant named Einar Johansen. Einar had recognized that the growing number of settlers and miners in the region needed cut lumber. Logs were plentiful, but properly dimensioned boards and planks required a sawmill's blade and power. Torsten completed his trading at the post, then walked to the sawmill. He had no specific business there, but the sound of the blade cutting through logs drew his attention. Einar was working alone, guiding a large pine log through the vertical blade driven by a water wheel. The air was thick with the smell of fresh-cut wood and filled with sawdust that hung in shafts of sunlight, streaming through gaps in the walls. Torsten watched for a while, then began looking at the waste material accumulating around the mill. Sawdust formed enormous piles where Einar shoveled it away from the blade. Wood shavings from planing operations created smaller piles of curled, thin strips. Most of this material was simply discarded or occasionally used as bedding for livestock. It had no commercial value. It was the inevitable byproduct of turning logs into boards. What caught Torsten's attention was steam rising from one of the older piles. The spring morning was cool, perhaps 45 degrees. Yet visible vapor rose from sawdust that had been accumulating for months. Torsten walked over and thrust his hand into the pile. 6 inches below the surface, the sawdust was warm. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding air. He dug deeper. A foot down, the material was quite warm, almost uncomfortable to hold. Einar noticed his interest and walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It does that," he said in Norwegian accented English. "The piles heat themselves, something about the wood breaking down inside. I've seen them steam even in winter." Torsten pulled his hand out and examined the sawdust clinging to his skin. The material was fine, almost powder-like in the oldest sections. Dry, despite the moisture that must be produced by whatever decomposition process was occurring inside. "Does it ever catch fire?" he asked. "Not that I've seen, just stays warm, like a blanket that makes its own heat." Einar shrugged. "It's good for nothing except hauling away. You want some? You can have all you can carry." Torsten stood looking at the pile for a long time. Something about this material, about its ability to trap and hold heat, seemed important. He thought about the root cellar's stable temperature, about earth holding warmth, about materials that absorbed and released heat slowly. Sawdust was light, easy to transport, and apparently capable of insulating heat effectively. The decomposition process was generating warmth, but even without that, the material structure, all those tiny wood particles creating countless small air spaces, would trap heat like the blanket Einar had described. "I might take you up on that," Torsten said. He did not explain why. He was not sure himself yet. But another piece of something larger was falling into place. The blacksmith shop stood 50 yards from the sawmill, a stone structure with a slate roof and wide doors that stood open to ventilate the heat from the forge. Torsten could feel warmth radiating from the building as he approached. Knut Andersen had been the settlement's blacksmith for 5 years, serving the scattered population of trappers, miners, and settlers who needed tools repaired, horses shod, or metal hardware fabricated. Torsten entered and found Knut working on a set of hinges, heating iron bars in the forge until they glowed orange, then hammering them into shape on his anvil. The ring of metal on metal filled the space. Sparks scattered with each impact. The forge itself was built from carefully fitted stones that formed a deep firebox with a chimney rising through the roof. Knut finished the piece he was working on and plunged it into a water trough. Steam erupted with a sharp hiss. He noticed Torsten and nodded in greeting. "Need something made?" "Not today. Just watching." Torsten moved closer to the forge. The fire had burned down after Knut's last heating, reduced to glowing coals but no longer flaming. Yet, the heat radiating from the structure was intense. Torsten could feel it on his face from 6 feet away. "That's a well-built forge," Torsten said. Knut wiped his hands on his leather apron. "Took me 2 months to build it right. The stones are everything. They have to fit tight, no gaps for heat to escape, and they have to be thick. These are 8 inches at least, some places 12. How long does it stay hot after the fire dies? Hours. I can bank the coals at end of day, go home, come back next morning, and the stones are still warm enough to hurt if you touch them wrong. Sometimes I can restart the fire just from the heat they held overnight. Torsten walked around the forge, studying its construction. The stones were dark gray, probably granite from the surrounding mountains. They were fitted together with minimal mortar, relying on their flat surfaces and weight to create stability. The thermal mass was enormous, hundreds of pounds of stone, all absorbing heat throughout the day as Knut worked. "Does it matter what kind of stone?" Torsten asked. Knut thought about this. "Dense stone is better, soft stone cracks from the heat, granite works, basalt is good if you can find it. Anything heavy and solid." He poked at the coals with an iron rod. "The heavier the stone, the more heat it holds. My father taught me that in Sweden, a good forge is built from stone that remembers the fire." That phrase stuck with Torsten. Stone that remembers the fire. The stones were absorbing thermal energy and releasing it slowly over time. The mass acted as a battery, storing heat and discharging it gradually. This was the same principle he had been observing: the root cellar's earth, the sawmill's sawdust, now the forge stones. All held heat far longer than wood or air. "If you built a cabin with stone foundations," Torsten said carefully, "thick ones, and kept a fire burning inside during the day, would the stones hold that heat?" Knut considered the question. "I suppose they would. Not as hot as a forge, but yes. Stone absorbs heat from any source." He looked at Torsten curiously. "You planning something?" "Maybe. Still thinking." Torsten stayed at the settlement for 3 days, sleeping in a corner of the trading post and spending his daylight hours thinking, sketching crude drawings with charcoal on scraps of bark, and asking careful questions of anyone who might have relevant knowledge. He talked to a stonemason who was building a chimney for a new cabin. He examined the construction of the trading post itself, noting how its thick log walls and raised floor kept it warmer than typical frontier structures. By the time he left for home, the core of an idea had formed. It was rough, lacking in specific details, but the fundamental concept was clear. He needed to build a cabin that incorporated 3 distinct layers working together to capture, store, and release heat. The first layer would be stone, heavy stone foundations, not just simple cornerstones, but actual walls built underground or at ground level, forming a perimeter that could absorb heat from the cabin's fire. These stones would act like Knut's forge, remembering the heat and releasing it slowly over many hours. The second layer would be insulation, sawdust, wood shavings, perhaps mixed with other materials, filling the space between the stone foundation and the cabin floor. This layer would prevent heat from escaping downward into the frozen earth. It would trap the warmth radiating from the stones and prevent it from dissipating uselessly. The third layer would be the floor itself. Not a simple dirt floor like his current cabin had. A proper wooden floor, thick planks that would absorb warmth from below and radiate it upward into the living space. The floor would be warm to walk on, warm to sleep on, maintaining livable temperature even hours after the fire died. The 3 layers would work together. Fire heats the cabin and the stone foundation. Stones absorb and hold that heat. Insulation traps it. Wooden floor distributes it upward. The system would not need constant fire. It would coast on stored heat, releasing it gradually through the night. Torsten knew the concept would seem insane to anyone he described it to. Mountain men built cabins quickly, using minimal materials. They accepted that fires had to burn constantly. They did not dig elaborate foundations or fill cavities with sawdust or build raised wooden floors. His design would take 10 times longer to construct than a normal cabin. It would require materials that seemed unnecessary. It would look strange, overbuilt, wasteful, but Torsten did not care about the opinions of others. He cared about building a shelter that would not fail the way his previous cabin had failed, a structure that could protect its occupant even if the fire died. Even if exhaustion or illness prevented constant vigilance. Even if everything went wrong, the cabin would stay warm enough to sustain life. He arrived back at his valley in late April and began preparing for construction. He had the entire summer to build. He would need every week of it. Spring in the Wyoming mountains was a brief window between impassable snow and the short growing season. Torsten used May to prepare his construction site. He selected a location half a mile from his current cabin on a slight rise with good drainage and clear sight lines. The spot was less convenient to water, requiring a longer walk to the creek, but it offered advantages his old location lacked. High ground meant no flooding during spring runoff. The rise provided natural air circulation. Most importantly, it gave him space to work without constant questions from neighbors passing his current cabin. He began by clearing the site of brush and small trees. Then he marked out the cabin's footprint using stakes and cord. 16 feet by 20 feet, the same dimensions as his previous structure. But instead of simply laying cornerstones and beginning to stack logs, Torsten started digging. He excavated a trench around the entire perimeter, 2 feet deep and 18 inches wide. The work was brutal. Mountain soil was rocky, full of roots, and still partially frozen in shaded areas. He worked alone, using a pickaxe to break up compacted earth and a shovel to remove it. Bjorn Lindstrom rode past in early June and stopped to watch. Torsten was waist-deep in the trench on the north side, throwing shovel loads of dirt and rocks onto a growing pile. Bjorn sat on his horse for several minutes before speaking. "You building a cabin or a grave?" he finally asked. Torsten climbed out of the trench, breathing hard. "Foundation. That's deeper than any foundation needs to be. You planning to build 2 stories? 1 story. But it needs to be right." Bjorn shook his head slowly. "Wasting time, Torsten. A cabin needs cornerstones. Maybe a few flat rocks to keep the bottom logs off the ground. You're digging like you're making a root cellar. Maybe that's part of it." "Part of what?" Torsten did not answer. He picked up his shovel and returned to the trench. Bjorn watched for another minute, then rode on. That evening, he told his wife Astrid about Torsten's strange excavation. Within days, other neighbors had ridden past to see for themselves. The consensus was that grief had affected Torsten's judgment. Digging an elaborate foundation for a simple cabin made no sense. It was wasted effort that could be spent trapping, hunting, or preparing for the next winter. Torsten ignored the comments and continued digging. By mid-June, he had completed the perimeter trench. It formed a perfect rectangle, 2 feet deep, uniform width, with level bottom. He had removed approximately 6 tons of earth and rock. A normal cabin foundation would have required moving perhaps 200 pounds of stone for corner supports. Torsten had moved 60 times that amount just to create empty space. And he was just beginning. The next phase would require stone. Not small rocks, but substantial pieces of granite and basalt from the surrounding mountainsides. He spent 2 weeks gathering them, using a travois pulled by his horse to haul loads from a rocky outcrop a mile away. Each stone was selected for flatness and density. Light, porous stone was rejected. He wanted heavy material that would hold heat the way Knute's forge did. By early July, Torsten had accumulated enough stone to begin construction. He started laying the foundation walls, working from the bottom of his excavated trench upward. Each stone was positioned carefully, fitted against its neighbors to minimize gaps. He used minimal mortar, just enough clay-based mud to fill spaces between stones, relying primarily on the weight and friction of properly fitted pieces to create stability. The foundation walls rose slowly. Torsten worked methodically, checking level constantly, rejecting stones that did not fit properly, sometimes spending an hour positioning a single large piece. The walls were 18 inches thick, far more substantial than necessary for structural support. A cabin the size Torsten was building could rest on walls 6 inches thick without any stability problems. But thermal mass required thickness. The more stone, the more heat it could absorb and store. Other trappers continued to stop and watch. The reactions ranged from puzzlement to open mockery. Einar Johansson, the sawmill owner, rode past in mid-July and spent 20 minutes examining the work. "You building a fortress?" he asked, expecting a war. "Just a cabin," Torsten replied, not looking up from the stone he was positioning. "That's not how cabins are built. Those walls are thick enough for a trading post. You're wasting stone and time." "Maybe." Einar watched longer, then shook his head. "Your choice. But winter comes whether you're ready or not. A man who spends all summer on foundations won't have time to build walls and roof." The comment reflected a real concern. Standard cabin construction took less than a week. Torsten had already spent 6 weeks just on excavation and foundation. He had not yet placed a single log for the actual cabin walls. At his current pace, he might not finish before snow arrived. An incomplete cabin was worse than no cabin at all. But Torsten had calculated his timeline carefully. The foundation work was the most labor-intensive phase. Once the stone walls were complete and the cavity filled with insulation, the actual cabin construction would proceed relatively quickly. He would have walls and roof before October. It would be tight, but achievable. By the first week of August, the foundation walls were complete. They rose 18 inches above ground level, forming a raised perimeter around the cabin footprint. The interior space was now a rectangular pit, 2 feet deep from original ground level to the top of the stone walls. This created a cavity with stone walls on all sides and earth at the bottom. The cavity measured roughly 13 feet by 17 feet interior dimensions, accounting for the wall thickness. Standing inside this space, looking up at ground level 2 feet above, the structure looked absurd. It resembled an empty swimming pool or an oversized coffin. Several neighbors who saw it laughed openly. Bjorn Lindström brought his oldest son to see what he called Torsten's folly. They stood at the edge, looking down at Torsten working inside, and Bjorn explained to his son how not to build a cabin. Torsten said nothing. He had known this reaction would come. People judged based on what they understood. They understood log cabins built quickly on simple foundations. They did not understand thermal mass or heat storage. Their mockery did not change the physics of what he was building. With the stone foundation complete, Torsten began the next phase. He needed a support structure for the floor, something strong enough to bear weight, but designed to allow heat from the stones to radiate upward into the insulating layer he would install above. The solution was a joist system, similar to what builders used in proper houses back east, but adapted for his specific requirements. He selected logs for joists with the same care he had used for foundation stones. Each log needed to be straight, approximately 8 inches in diameter, and long enough to span the 20-foot width of the cabin. He rejected logs with excessive taper or visible rot. Over 2 weeks, he cut and hauled 14 logs that met his standards. Each one was debarked completely using a draw knife, then shaped on the contact surfaces to ensure flat bearing on the stone walls. The joists were positioned 16 inches apart, running parallel across the short dimension of the cabin. They rested directly on the stone foundation walls, creating a grid of support beams with open space between them. Torsten notched each joist where it met the stone, creating a positive lock that prevented shifting. Then he drilled holes through the joists and drove wooden pegs into the stone walls, pinning each joist in place. The result was a rigid framework that could support substantial weight. The spacing and design drew more questions from visitors. 16-inch joist spacing was excessive for a simple cabin floor. Standard construction used joists 24 or even 30 inches apart. Closer spacing meant more logs, more work, more weight. But Torsten wanted a floor that would not flex or sag, and he wanted the joists positioned to allow maximum airflow between them for heat distribution. With the joists in place, the cavity beneath the future floor was now divided into 13 long channels, each 16 inches wide and 2 feet deep. These channels ran the full length of the cabin. From above, looking down between the joists, the stone foundation was visible at the bottom, with 2 feet of empty space between the stones and where the floor would eventually sit. Bjorn Lindström visited again in late August and studied the joist work with genuine confusion. "You're building a stage," he said. "That floor is going to be 2 feet off the ground. You'll need steps to get into your own cabin. Probably, Torsten agreed. Why? What's the purpose of all this empty space underneath? Insulation. Insulation from what? The ground? The ground doesn't need insulating. It's just there. Torsten did not try to explain. The concept of ground temperature affecting cabin warmth was not something most trappers considered. They built on the ground because that was where the ground was. The idea that Earth below frost line maintained stable temperature, or that frozen surface soil could drain heat from a cabin, was not part of common knowledge. Torsten had learned it through observation and thought. Explaining it to someone who had not made those observations would require more time and patience than he wanted to invest. It'll make sense when it's done, he said simply. Bjorn rode away, shaking his head. That evening, he told several neighbors that Torsten was building the strangest cabin anyone had ever seen, and it probably would not even work properly when finished. September brought the need to fill the cavity beneath the joist system. Torsten had been planning this phase since his visit to Einar's sawmill in April. He returned to the settlement with his horse and a large canvas tarp. Einar was surprised to see him loading sawdust and wood shavings into bags fashioned from old flour sacks. "You're taking my waste?" Einar asked, genuinely puzzled. "If you don't need it." "I've got piles of it. Been meaning to haul it away. You're doing me a favor." Einar helped load the bags onto Torsten's travois. "What's it for?" "Insulation." Einar looked at the fine sawdust, the curled shavings, the mix of refuse from months of mill operation. "That's garbage. It rots. It attracts mice. You're going to insulate with garbage? We'll see." Torsten made 6 trips over 2 weeks, hauling approximately 400 pounds of material each time. At the cabin site, he also gathered other materials: dried moss from the north sides of trees, pine needles, which were naturally resistant to decay, charcoal from old fire pits, crushed into small pieces. He mixed everything together in proportions he could only guess at. Roughly half sawdust and shavings, a quarter pine needles, and moss, a quarter charcoal. The mixture served multiple purposes. Sawdust provided bulk and trapped air in countless tiny spaces. Pine needles added structure and resisted compression. Charcoal absorbed moisture and prevented rot. Moss filled gaps and added another layer of air trapping. The combination created an insulating material unlike anything used in standard construction. Neighbors who saw him spreading this mixture into the cavity beneath his cabin floor were openly incredulous. Bjorn Lindstrom stood at the edge watching Torsten shovel the material between the joists, filling the channels from stone foundation up to the underside of where floor planks would sit. "You're building your cabin on a compost pile," Bjorn said flatly. "No, on joists. The fill is just insulation. It's going to rot. It's going to smell. Mice are going to nest in it. Come spring, you'll have the biggest mouse den in Wyoming under your floor." Torsten continued shoveling. The charcoal would discourage mice. The depth would prevent easy access. But he did not argue. He simply worked, spreading the insulating mixture evenly, packing it down slightly but not compressing it too much. Compressed insulation lost its air spaces. Air was what trapped heat. The mixture needed to be settled enough to stay in place, but loose enough to maintain its structure. By late September, the entire cavity was filled. 2 feet of mixed organic insulation sat between the stone foundation and the joist system. The stone walls rose above this fill, creating a raised platform. From the outside, the cabin site looked bizarre. Stone walls forming a rectangle at ground level, joists spanning across them, and the interior filled with what appeared to be decomposing forest floor material. Several trappers passing through the valley stopped to look. Most assumed Torsten had lost his mind. One suggested openly that grief over Ingrid's death had broken something in him. Another offered to help him build a proper cabin before winter, suggesting they could have a functional structure completed in a week if Torsten would abandon his current project. Torsten declined politely. He was too far committed to stop now. October arrived with cold nights and snow flurries. Torsten worked longer days, aware that winter was approaching faster than his construction schedule allowed. The floor installation was critical and could not be rushed. He had purchased milled planks from Einer's sawmill during one of his sawdust hauling trips. The planks were 2 inches thick, 8 inches wide, and cut from dense pine. They were expensive by frontier standards, but Torsten needed dimensional lumber, not rough-hewn logs. He laid the planks perpendicular to the joists, creating a floor surface that ran the length of the cabin. Each plank was fitted carefully against its neighbor, with gaps no wider than 1/8 of an inch. He used square-cut nails to secure the planks to the joists, driving 3 nails into each joist at every plank crossing. The result was a rigid floor that did not flex or squeak when walked upon. But Torsten added features that made the floor unique. Every 8th plank was not nailed permanently. Instead, he attached these planks using wooden pegs that could be removed, allowing the plank to be lifted like a hinged door. This created access panels to the insulating cavity beneath. The panels were invisible when closed, appearing identical to the rest of the floor, but they could be opened for inspection or maintenance. The floor sat exactly 2 feet above the original ground level. Standing inside the cabin footprint, a person's feet were now on a wooden platform elevated on stone walls and insulated beneath by 2 feet of mixed organic material. It looked and felt strange. Most cabin floors were at ground level or perhaps 6 inches above on simple stone supports. Torsten's floor was high enough that entering the cabin would require a step up. Bjorn visited in mid-October and walked across the completed floor. His boots made solid sounds on the thick planks. He had to admit the craftsmanship was excellent. The floor did not give or flex. It was level and well built, but the height bothered him. "You'll freeze in winter," he said. "Cold air sinks. Your floor is up high, but the cold will pour underneath. That space below will be like an icebox. The stone walls are enclosed. Cold air can't get under the floor." Bjorn knelt and looked at the perimeter where floor met stone walls. Torsten had indeed sealed the gap with clay mixed with horsehair and pine resin, the same mixture he had seen used for chinking between logs on well-built cabins. The seal looked tight. Even so, all that empty space underneath will be cold, and whatever you filled it with will just make it worse once moisture gets in. Torsten did not respond. The entire point of his design was that the space underneath would not be cold. The stone foundation would absorb heat from the cabin's fire. That heat would radiate into the insulating layer. The insulation would prevent the heat from escaping into the frozen ground. The floor would warm from below. But explaining this to someone who had not thought through the physics seemed pointless. Bjorn would not believe it until he experienced it. November came with serious cold. Torsten worked frantically to complete the cabin walls and roof. The walls went up relatively quickly once he started. He used traditional notched log construction for speed, though he fitted each log more carefully than was standard. The roof was simple, angled to shed snow, covered with split planks and multiple layers of bark. It would not win awards, but it was functional and weatherproof. By the 3rd week of November, the cabin was enclosed. Door installed, window shuttered, fireplace built into the north wall using the same careful stone selection he had used for the foundation. The interior was rough, unfinished, but livable. Torsten moved his possessions from the old cabin and prepared to test his design. On November 22nd, he built the first fire. The day was cold, perhaps 15 degrees, with wind making it feel colder. He started with small kindling, gradually adding larger pieces until flames filled the firebox. The stone fireplace drew well, smoke rising cleanly through the chimney. Heat radiated into the cabin space. Within an hour, the air temperature at head height reached a comfortable 60 degrees. But Torsten was not watching the air temperature. He was monitoring the floor. He walked across it barefoot, feeling for warmth. Initially, the planks felt neutral, neither warm nor cold. After 2 hours, they felt slightly warm. After 4 hours of continuous fire, the floor was noticeably warm to the touch. He knelt and placed his palm flat on the planks. The warmth was gentle but unmistakable. He lifted one of the access panels and reached down into the insulating cavity. The sawdust mixture was warm, several inches below the surface. The heat from the cabin's fire was conducting downward through the floor planks, into the insulation, and being absorbed by the mass of material filling the space above the stone foundation. Torsten let the fire burn through the afternoon and evening. By nightfall, the entire floor was warm enough that walking on it barefoot was comfortable. He added a final large log to the firebox around 9 in the evening, then let the fire die naturally. This was the test. If his design worked, the floor would stay warm through the night, as stored heat radiated upward from the stone foundation and insulating layer. He lay on his sleeping platform, wrapped in blankets, and waited. The air temperature in the cabin dropped as the fire reduced to coals, then to ash. By midnight, he could see his breath. But the floor beneath him remained warm. He climbed down and walked across the planks. They were cooler than they had been at sunset, but still noticeably warm. Warmer than any cabin floor he had ever experienced when no fire was burning. At dawn, he woke to a cabin that was cold but not frozen. The air temperature was perhaps 35 degrees. Outside, it was 10 below zero, a 45-degree difference, and the floor was still faintly warm to the touch. Torsten spent November experimenting with his system. Each night presented a different test. He varied when he let the fire die. He tried building hotter fires versus longer burning fires. He monitored how quickly the floor cooled and how long it retained useful warmth. The results were consistent and remarkable. A fire burning for 6 hours heated the floor enough to stay warm for 8 to 10 hours after the flames died. The thermal mass in the stone foundation and insulating layer acted exactly as he had theorized. Heat absorbed during the day released slowly through the night. The rate of release was gradual enough that even on the coldest nights, the floor never reached outside temperature. He began to understand the system's behavior. The stone foundation was the key. Those thick walls absorbed enormous amounts of heat. They warmed slowly during the day as fire heated the cabin, but once warm, they released heat for hours. The insulating layer above the stones trapped that rising heat, preventing it from dissipating uselessly. The wooden floor absorbed warmth from the insulation and radiated it upward into the living space. The entire cabin stayed warmer than any structure Torsten had previously occupied. Even when the fire was completely dead and outside temperatures dropped below zero, the interior rarely fell below 35 degrees. That was cold enough to be uncomfortable for extended periods, but it was not dangerous. A person could sleep through the night without risk of freezing. More importantly, if someone was ill or injured and unable to maintain a fire, the cabin would not become a death trap. Torsten thought often about Ingrid during these weeks. The cabin he now occupied would have saved her life. If she had fallen ill in this structure, instead of their previous cabin, the fire going out would not have been fatal. The temperature would have dropped, but slowly. She would have been uncomfortable but not exposed to the lethal cold that had killed her. He did not share his results with neighbors. They still viewed his cabin as a foolish experiment. Most assumed he was struggling through the winter in his strange, overbuilt structure, probably regretting the time wasted on elaborate foundations and unnecessary insulation. Torsten let them think what they wanted. He was warm, comfortable, and proving daily that his design worked. December arrived with heavier snow and colder temperatures. Normal winters in the Wyoming mountains were harsh. The winter of 1842-43 would prove extraordinary. A cold snap was building in the north, moving south toward the valley where Torsten and his neighbors lived. The kind of cold that tested everything: structures, supplies, animals, and human endurance. The kind of cold that killed without warning or mercy. Torsten did not know what was coming, but his cabin was ready. The temperature dropped on December 18th, not gradually, but suddenly. Morning started at 20 below zero. By afternoon, it was 30 below. By nightfall, 40 below. Wind drove the temperature lower still. Exposed skin froze in less than a minute. Breath crystallized instantly. Metal became painful to touch, even through gloves. The cold settled over the valley like a physical presence. It found every weakness in every structure. Gaps in chinking became channels for freezing air. Poorly fitted doors allowed drafts that dropped interior temperatures rapidly. Dirt floors became frozen solid, radiating cold upward into living spaces. Every cabin became a battle between fire and cold, with constant vigilance required to maintain the fire's advantage. Bjorn Lindstrom's family took shifts through the night. Bjorn would tend the fire until midnight, then his wife Astrid would take over until dawn. Their 3 children slept in a pile near the fireplace, wrapped in every blanket the family owned. Even with constant fire, the cabin's temperature hovered around 45 degrees. The walls were crusted with frost. Water froze in buckets within minutes of being brought inside. Other families in the valley faced similar struggles. Fires had to burn hot and constant. Wood consumption was enormous. Several families ran low on their winter supply and had to venture out in dangerous cold to cut more. One trapper, living alone 5 miles south, made the mistake of letting his fire die while he slept. He woke at dawn, barely able to move, his body temperature dangerously low. He managed to restart his fire and survived, but the experience terrified him. The cold lasted 5 days. 5 days of temperatures that never rose above 20 below, often dropping to 50 below at night. 5 days of burning through wood supplies at unsustainable rates. 5 days of exhaustion from constant fire tending. 5 days that revealed exactly how marginal frontier survival really was. Torsten's cabin performed differently. He maintained his fire during daylight hours, keeping the interior at a comfortable 60 degrees. The stone foundation absorbed heat steadily. The floor stayed warm throughout the day. But at night, instead of loading the firebox with logs and praying they would last until dawn, Torsten let the fire die around midnight. The cabin cooled, but slowly. By dawn, the air temperature was around 40 degrees. Cold, but not dangerous, and the floor remained warm enough to walk on barefoot. The thermal mass system was releasing stored heat at a steady rate. The insulation was preventing heat loss to the frozen ground. The design was working exactly as intended. Torsten slept through the nights without worry. No shifts to tend fire. No fear of waking frozen. No desperate calculations about wood supply lasting until spring. His cabin had transformed the relationship between fire and survival. Dawn on December 23rd was brutally cold. Bjorn Lindstrom had been awake most of the night, maintaining his fire. His family was safe but exhausted. As gray light appeared, he decided to check on neighbors, making sure no one had frozen during the night. His first stop was Torsten's cabin. He approached, expecting to see heavy smoke from a chimney that had been burning all night. Instead, no smoke rose from Torsten's chimney. The fire was out. Bjorn felt immediate alarm. He had given Torsten grief about his strange construction, but he did not want the man dead. He dismounted and approached the door quickly. Before he could knock, the door opened. Torsten stood in the doorway wearing a simple shirt and trousers. No heavy coat. No visible sign of distress. He looked comfortable, rested, warm. "Bjorn, you're out early." Bjorn stared. "Your fire is out." "Yes." "Let it die around midnight." "You let it die? In this cold?" Bjorn pushed past Torsten into the cabin. The interior air was cool but not frozen. He could not see his breath, which meant the temperature was above freezing. Possibly above 40 degrees. In a cabin with no fire burning for 6 hours. In weather that was 50 below outside. Bjorn walked to the fireplace. Cold ash. No coals. The fire had been dead for hours. He looked around the cabin, trying to understand. Then he noticed his feet. He was standing on the wooden floor in his heavy boots, but he could feel warmth through the leather. The floor was warm. He knelt and placed his bare hand on the planks. They were noticeably warm to the touch. Not hot, but warmer than any cabin floor should be, with no fire burning. He looked up at Torsten. "How?" Torsten smiled slightly. "The 3 floors everyone laughed at. They hold heat. The stone foundation absorbs it during the day. The insulation traps it. The floor releases it slowly. The cabin stays warm for hours after the fire dies." Bjorn stood and walked across the floor, feeling the warmth through his boots. He moved to the walls, which were not frosted like his own cabin's walls. He examined the doorframe, which showed no ice buildup. Everything about the cabin defied what he knew about frontier structures in extreme cold. "Can I see underneath?" Torsten lifted one of the hinged floor panels. Warm air rose from the cavity below. Bjorn looked down at the sawdust and shaving mixture. At the stone walls visible at the bottom, he reached down and felt the insulating material. It was warm, several inches deep. Understanding finally arrived. This was not magic or luck. This was engineering. Bjorn returned home and told Astrid what he had seen. She did not believe him at first. A cabin staying warm with no fire was impossible. But Bjorn's description was detailed and genuine. By afternoon, despite the dangerous cold, 3 other families had made the trip to Torsten's cabin to see for themselves. Torsten welcomed them inside. The cabin was comfortable, the fire burning again after his morning restart. He let them feel the floor warmth, explained the stone foundation, showed them the insulating cavity. He lifted multiple access panels so they could see the full system. He described how heat from the fireplace conducted downward through the floor planks into the sawdust mixture, how the stone walls absorbed and stored thermal energy, how the insulation prevented heat from escaping into the frozen ground. The visitors asked practical questions. How deep were the stone walls? How thick was the insulation? What mixture had he used? How long did construction take? Could existing cabins be modified to include the system, or did it only work in new construction? Torsten answered everything honestly. He explained that retrofitting existing cabins would be difficult but not impossible. The floor would need to be removed, foundation trenches dug around the interior perimeter, stone walls built, insulation added, and new floors installed. It would essentially require gutting and rebuilding the cabin from the ground up. But for new construction, the technique was straightforward, just time-consuming and requiring materials most trappers considered unnecessary. Over the following weeks, as the extreme cold finally broke and temperatures returned to normal winter levels, word of Torsten's thermal floor system spread through the scattered trapping community. Some remained skeptical, believing the visitors had exaggerated what they saw. Others began planning to incorporate similar designs into new cabins. A few asked Torsten directly for help, offering to pay him for his knowledge or his labor. Torsten refused payment but offered advice freely. He sketched designs for anyone who asked. He explained the principles of thermal mass and insulation in terms practical men could understand. He emphasized that the system was not complicated, just different from standard practice. Stone that holds heat, insulation that traps it, floor that distributes it, 3 layers working together. By spring of 1843, 2 other trappers in the valley had begun building cabins using Torsten's method. Their construction drew the same mockery and skepticism Torsten had faced, but now there was a completed example to point to. Torsten's cabin had survived the coldest winter in recent memory while providing comfort and safety impossible in standard structures. That proof was more convincing than any explanation. The technique began to spread. Slowly at first, limited to men who had directly experienced the brutal cold snap and understood viscerally why better insulation mattered. But gradually, the knowledge moved through the frontier community. Trappers talked to traders, traders talked to settlers, settlers talked to new arrivals. Within 5 years, variations of Torsten's thermal floor system appeared throughout the Wyoming and Montana territories. The specific details varied based on available materials and individual skill, but the core principle remained consistent. Build foundations that store heat, insulate beneath the floor, create thermal mass that sustains warmth long after fires die. Torsten lived in his cabin for 4 more years. He continued trapping, though less aggressively than before Ingrid's death. He helped neighbors build improved structures, never asking for payment, simply sharing what he had learned. He became known not as the strange, grief-stricken man who had built a foolish cabin, but as someone who understood heat and construction in ways most frontier builders did not. In 1847, Torsten left the mountains. The fur trade was collapsing. Beaver populations had been trapped out across much of the Rockies. Fashion had shifted away from felt hats toward silk, destroying demand for pelts. The economic foundation of the mountain man era was crumbling. Men who had spent decades in the wilderness were returning to civilization or moving to new territories where different opportunities existed. Torsten sold his cabin to a Norwegian family, moving west to try homesteading. He explained the thermal floor system carefully, showed them how to maintain it, and wished them well. Then he traveled to Oregon, where land was available and a different kind of life was possible. He established a small farm, remarried in 1849, and lived quietly until his death in 1871. His Oregon neighbors knew him as a capable farmer and carpenter. Few knew about his years in the Wyoming mountains or the innovation he had developed there, but the cabins remained. Torsten's original structure stood until 1923, occupied by successive families who appreciated its unusual warmth. When it was finally dismantled to make room for a more modern house, engineers from the University of Wyoming examined the foundation system. They marveled at the sophistication of the design and the effectiveness of materials that had remained functional for over 80 years. Other cabins built using Torsten's methods lasted similar lengths of time. The thermal floor system proved remarkably durable. Stone foundations required no maintenance. Organic insulation, protected from moisture by careful sealing, remained effective for decades. The floors stayed warm in winter, cool in summer, and comfortable year-round. Modern historians estimate that Torsten's innovation directly saved dozens of lives over the following decades. Families survived cold snaps that would have been lethal in standard cabins. Sick individuals recovered in structures warm enough to support healing. Children grew up in homes where overnight cold was inconvenient rather than dangerous. The exact number of lives saved is unknowable, but the impact was real and lasting. The phrase, "built like Ericsson's cabin," became frontier shorthand for construction that prioritized function over speed, that incorporated intelligence into design, that solved problems before they became fatal. The compliment spread beyond Wyoming, carried by travelers and settlers moving across the West. Torsten Halvorsen never patented his thermal floor system. He never wrote formal plans or instruction manuals. He never profited financially from an innovation that changed how people survived in one of the harshest environments on the American frontier. His legacy was built into the ground, hidden beneath floors, invisible to casual observation, but unmistakable to anyone who spent a winter in a properly constructed cabin. He had solved a problem that killed his wife by thinking carefully about heat, mass, and time. And he had shared that solution freely with anyone who needed it. That quiet generosity, combined with genuine innovation, left a mark on the frontier that lasted far longer than his lifetime.